Hi everyone and welcome. We are joined today by Evarist Bartolo, the former foreign minister of Malta. So welcome back to the program. It's great to see you again.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Glenn.
So we were going to discuss today what should be, in my opinion, the main discussion in Europe, but a discussion no one seems to be having, which is the failure to establish an inclusive and functional pan-European security architecture. And I guess as a quick introduction to our listeners to this topic is that at the end of the Cold War, we signed agreements for an inclusive European security architecture based on the so-called Helsinki process. Security architecture which included Russia. And we then changed our minds and we more or less began to walk away from the principles of the Charter of Paris for a New Europe. And some of the reasoning was that the Russians were weak. And instead of having this inclusive security architecture, we looked towards the promise of a hegemonic peace or liberal hegemony, as we now refer to it. And this, of course, was facilitated through NATO expansion. So essentially eventually including all European countries except for the largest country in terms of now population, territory, economy, and military. So and this meant that we cancelled to a large extent agreements for this post-Cold War pan-European security architecture. Now the hegemonic peace we can see now has failed and burned. There's no longer a hegemon and there's no longer peace. And I think Ukraine has become both the cemetery for the unipolar world order, but it could also become the cemetery of NATO under its current objectives. So again, what Europe is discussing now is what comes next. In my opinion, it's quite unfortunate that if you look towards Germany, they're saying, well, I guess the solution is to spend hundreds of billions on weapons and take a leading role in confronting Russia. We've done this before. Well, the Germans have done this before in their history, and I don't think this is the recipe for peace in Europe, for simply to all arm ourselves to the teeth. Instead, in my opinion, we should revisit this pan-European option, which we abandoned in the 90s and predictably brought us to this horrible place we're now. So I'm very glad, to have you here, Evarist, to discuss these things. And I thought a good place to start could be the Helsinki Accords, because this is really where we laid the foundation, wasn't it, between, how could the communist bloc of the East versus the capitalist bloc on the West find some common agreements, how to essentially share a continent. This came in 1975. So I was wondering if you can flesh out a bit about the ideas behind this and why this was, I guess, the founding pillar.
Well, Glenn, I think till a few weeks ago, I would have shared your optimistic interpretation of this process. But I've spent quite a bit of time now going through 50 years of national security archives of the United States, which are available online, which give a lot of what was happening behind the scenes when it comes to American and European diplomacy. I would say, at best, the United States and I think the center-right European leaders saw Helsinki and the CSE process as politics of gesture, at best, much more symbolic than meaningful. At worst, this kind of diplomacy can be classified as perfidious diplomacy, which the United Kingdom used to be accused of for many centuries, especially by the French, that they carried out a diplomacy which was full of treachery and betrayed promises. Why am I saying this? Because even if we go, first of all, I would say, even during the Second World War, Churchill had already drawn up plans to attack Russia. The project Unthinkable, which was declassified in 1998, I mean, you're just working with your ally to defeat Hitler, and already you're thinking of turning on your ally to defeat him. My impression is that historically, even if we take the 19th and the 20th century, the only Russia that the United States and Western Europe can live with is not as an equal partner. It has to be either a weak Russia or a defeated Russia. And even if we just take the final Helsinki Accord of 1975, when you see the evaluation that Henry Kissinger makes of it, because President Ford is worried that the Baltics have already started protesting, that with the Helsinki Accord, their boundaries will not change, which means that they will always remain within the Soviet bloc. Kissinger tells him, don't worry, Helsinki Accord is meaningless. It's not a treaty, and it's a paper worth nothing. And I think that that already shows a lot, even in 1975. So we're not talking about, the last 30 years, 20 years, but even in 1975, it was very obvious that for the United States, what was important was NATO. And in fact, in these confidential documents that we see online in the National Security Archive, the United States says our approach towards Europe is based on 3 pillars. Number 1, NATO. Number 2, the European Union. Number 3, CSCE. And I repeat, and I quote Kissinger again, saying, well, this is grandstanding of the left. Sort of, let's tolerate them a bit to play around with this concept, of the talent and building a kind of European security architecture. But really, what we want to work at is to strengthen NATO. And more than that, actually says that the CSCE is a good Trojan horse, because through the basket of human rights and political democracy, we can actually help those groups in Eastern Europe and in the Baltics to weaken the Soviet Union. Whereas the Soviet Union was seeing CSCE as a security arrangement, I think the United States and Western Europe were seeing it as a good Trojan horse into the Soviet bloc through the weaponization of human rights and political democracy. This might sound very pessimistic and might sound very reductionist, but I repeat, a close scrutiny of these documents, and then especially of what happens after 1990, I think would bear out what I'm saying.
Yeah, there's a very interesting Russian scholar, Fyodor Lukyanov, who I think or remember once wrote something similar. He pointed out that the Helsinki Accords, it placed a time bomb within the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, the Western countries never, I guess, lived up to their side of the deal, which was that ambition should be to overcome some of this zero-sum bloc politics. And there's also a lot of literature who supports what you're saying. I forgot her first name, Sarotte. She's a scholar, I think French or American. She had written extensively on on the failure of this inclusive security architecture. And she also writes that the Americans were never really serious about the Helsinki Accords, that this was seen as something that would undermine an international system dominated by the US and again dominated by NATO. So there's also been other agreements. So when they decided to expand NATO, for example, the Americans then proposed this NATO-Russia Final Act of 1997, which was supposed to bring them together. but really it was just so the Russians wouldn't complain too much about NATO expansionism. Indeed, in the book of Sarotesh, he quotes Bill Clinton, who, when he was introduced to this deal, he said, wait a second, so this means we have to sign this, and we promise not to put our military forces in Eastern Europe. However, we can just withdraw from it whenever we don't want to abide by it. And it's like, yeah, okay, we'll sign it. So again, it's a way of overcoming opposition while we still plow ahead. And I think this is the main problem. But taking us to the present time,
but Glenn, let's go a bit back to 1990. So we're talking about Helmut Kohl and George Bush. George Bush asks Helmut Kohl to come to Camp David. This is 1990. He tells him, don't bring Genscher with you, because Genscher is not doing what we would like him to do. Genscher was a voice in the desert saying, why do we need NATO? With the Warsaw Treaty Organization gone, why shouldn't NATO morph into the CSE and have one security architecture which would include everybody and not against the Soviet Union? And Bush tells him, we must not let Genscher, get away with this in terms of seeing that we agree with him. We do not agree with him. And in fact, Kohl tells Bush, no, I will not bring Genscher. This was just 2 years before Genscher was not a foreign minister anymore. So even in 1990, with Genscher saying, let's have a common European security architecture, which is cooperative rather than confrontational, Bush tells him, no, we don't want that. And we must not let, and I'm quoting verbatim now, we must not let the Soviet Union snatch victory out of the jaws of defeat. Let's not talk about equal partners. Come on. We won. We are the winners. They are the losers. They have to abide by what we tell them. This is obviously never said publicly, but in these documents of the National Security Archive, both at the time of Bush and then much more at the time of Clinton, you're going to find this over and over again. With what it was called the two-track approach. Tell something to the Russians, but then when you're talking to Germany, and when you're talking to the Baltics, and when you're talking to the Eastern Europeans, especially the Poles, tell them something else. In the meantime, the State Department is working on a plan to enlarge NATO. Obviously, the Soviet Union and eventually Russia, through their intelligence network, used to know that there were really practical programs on when the enlargement was to take place. But they would never tell this to the Russians. They would tell them, no, don't worry. Enlargement will take place only gradually, and we will consult you at every stage. But then you see that this is not the case. And throughout, something that really strikes me, there is a meeting between the Manfred Werner, who was the General Secretary of NATO at the time that we're talking now in the 90s. He's talking to the Speaker of the Duma. By the end, the Speaker of the Duma had to tell him, I thought you came here for us to discuss, not to give me a lecture. And this is consistently. And then you see the weakness even of Gorbachev, and the Gorbachev, like Primakov and the others are sort of advising him and warning him. You are giving in to everything, and they do not respect us. We are not considered equal, and this is going to humiliate and to hurt Russia and to hurt Europe a lot, because a new dividing line is coming.
Yeah, this is the very treacherous history of it, because last month I was in Georgia with the former American ambassador Jack Matlock, who was
Yeah.
there, who negotiated an end to the Cold War with the Russians, as ambassador to the Soviet Union. But he also made the same point which you make now. He argued that, under Clinton, he was telling the Russians, listen, we will find some inclusive Europe, blah blah blah. But at the same time, he was going to the other Eastern European countries and saying, "Oh, don't worry, NATO's coming. We're gonna expand." And it was all, as he said, he was speaking out of both sides of his mouth, eventually deceiving the Russians all along. And other agreements we had as well, because we had the Russian partnership for peace. And they sold this to the Russians as, look, this is an alternative to NATO expansion. But instead, it was a way to get all the Eastern European countries, the militaries, aligned with NATO standards. And instead of being an alternative, it was a stepping stone towards NATO expansion. And also, yes, Ambassador Matlock points out, this was not a change in strategy or something. It was just deception. Just keep the Russians calm and not too much opposition while we plow ahead with our goal for hegemonic peace. But it was always intended to stab them in the back, effectively.
Yes, I agree. And you can see this even, for example, in 1954. So we're talking now a good practically 20 years before the Helsinki Accord. The Soviet Union already suggested that there should be a security conference, to discuss common to build confidence between the two sides. And the United States says, no, we do not feel any need for that. In the meantime, and this is frightening, in the meantime, the Pentagon was drawing up plans to invade Russia on the 1st of January 1957. This is the drop shot operation, where they actually planned to drop 300 nuclear bombs on Russia, 20,000 tons of conventional weapons, to weaken Russia and they would obliterate, I think, 75% of the industrial potential, kill over nearly 3 million, actually, 3 million people and nearly 7 million casualties. And this is, so not even 2 tracks, but even triple tracks, saying something, doing something else, and in the meantime, all the time preparing for war. And this is really, really worrying. And I would like to also to point out to a particular episode at the beginning of 1990 in January, a meeting between Lech Wałęsa and Bill Clinton. Lech Wałęsa tells Bill Clinton, don't trust the Russians, because in one hand they hold a pen, in the other hand they have a hand grenade. And remember, the Visegrad countries are part of the West. Russia is not part of the West. So it's even civilizational. It's not only, we want a weak Russia, either because we don't like its political and economic system or because we want its resources. Russia has to behave. If it doesn't do what we like, we will invade Russia. We might be Napoleon, we might be Hitler, we might be others, but I repeat, it seems as if the only Russia that the United States and Western Europe is ready to live with is a weak and defeated Russia. And so when you have the Charter of Helsinki, and then you have Paris, and then you have the Istanbul Declaration, the language there is so good in terms of mutual security, how to have dialogue, how to have mediation, how to work together so that not one country feels threatened by the others. It's interesting that when the Russians saw that the United States was going to keep on pushing for enlargement, at one point it makes a suggestion that let's have a security conference so that we address the security concerns of the Baltic countries and the Eastern European countries. There is an acknowledgement, even by the Russians, that they understand the anxieties of Eastern Europe and the Baltics, who had just come out of their Soviet experience. They understand that anxiety, but is the way to address it to enlarge NATO, or we can have a kind of security arrangement. And both Bush and Clinton dismissed this as saying, listen, it's nice, the Helsinki is a nice dream, but what we have is, reality is NATO. And what is also interesting is both the Baltics and the Eastern European countries say we want to be in NATO not because we see a threat from Russia, but so that we control any authoritarian initiatives and surges within our countries. So they do not see it. So it's a domestic concern more than that they are worried that that Russia then is going to attack them. But what is very, very clear is that the United States wants to dominate Western Europe and wants to dominate Russia. So no equal partnership. And what is also very, very clear is do not let Germany and Russia get close together. We must always do whatever we can to keep them separate from each other. At one point, there is a discussion. For the unification to take place, Germany must remain out of NATO. Again, two-track approach. They give the Russians the illusion that, yes, that might be considered, that might be discussed. But then when talking face-to-face with Helmut Kohl, it's very clear we want you in NATO. Because if you are not in NATO, and we have to withdraw the nuclear weapons that we have based in NATO, which other European country is going to accept our nuclear weapons? See, this is the kind of logic that we see happening over and over again. Genscher believed that that was possible to keep not only Germany out of NATO, but actually to disband NATO to have a common security architecture. But obviously the United States would not hear of anything like that, whether it was Bush, Clinton, eventually Obama, Biden, all of them. It has been consistent. The Helsinki spirit, I think, has been killed before it was even born, because it was not believed in by the United States. The Eastern Europeans did not believe in it. And I would say the center-right politicians in Europe did also not believe in it, especially when we're talking of the northern countries, because I think countries like Spain and Italy and possibly France, I would say, would have believed in Helsinki to bring it about. But otherwise, in hindsight now, I would say that it had never a chance of succeeding, also because the energy and the push was for the enlargement of NATO, to enlarge first the European Union, and then at a second stage, enlarge NATO. I remember when I met Minister Lavrov in Sochi 4 years ago, and he was telling me the discussion that he had with President Romano Prodi at the time. Prodi had told him, this is going to work to your advantage, the fact that we are going to include the Baltic countries and the Eastern European countries in the European Union, because now, as they become part of our club, we will calm them. They will feel secure and safe, and they will be less anti-Russian. Lavrov told him, mark my words, in a few years we'll see that the European Union has become more anti-Russian rather than that you have calmed the Baltic states and the Eastern European states. And unfortunately, it has happened. It has happened. And one thing I would like to say about this, and this is from my personal experience, I don't know whether to laugh or to cry. So when in 2021 and also in 2022, Minister Lavrov was writing to all of us as foreign affairs ministers of the European Union, and he was obviously quoting the Helsinki Accord, the Charter of Paris, and the Istanbul Declaration to talk about indivisible security, and that my security does not threaten your security, and that we must work together to build this common European home that had died obviously with Gorbachev, he wrote to each and every one of us. At least as a matter of courtesy, I sat down to answer him and sent a reply straight away, saying that I believe in cooperative security, that we should work together, we should negotiate. All hell broke loose. They said, who authorized you to write to him? We do not write to Minister Lavrov. We do not want to talk to Minister Lavrov. If something is going to happen, things have to be settled on the battlefield. I mean, can you imagine? Not even having the courtesy to answer. They didn't even go into the merits of whether what I said was idiotic or whether it was treacherous or whether it put the security of the European Union at risk. Simply the gesture, simply the step to answer. I mean, this is terrible. I couldn't believe it. And I at that point with some people I said, but even Bismarck teaches us that when we declare war, we have to be elegant and write a nice letter, let alone when we're trying to seek peace.
Well, I've talked to many diplomats, European diplomats, and they often they confirm what you say, that whenever they want to have a courteous or good relations with the Russians, they often countered not by no, we are anti-Russian, but they're saying we need solidarity. We have to speak with one voice, and the problem is that one voice is always one of ignoring, disrespectful and confrontational. So whenever they talk about solidarity, one voice, which sounds wonderful, but that one voice is always not optimal. That this is always the common denominator to take this hostile view.
And Glenn, actually, it's the one voice is no voice. I mean, why should I say it's no voice? Because it's the ventriloquist voice. The voice is coming out of Washington. And what happens here is like a puppet. You repeat what the voice told you in Washington. And from my experience, again, the only relationship that the United States tolerates with Western Europe, and it did this over the years. It did it even with the Marshall Plan. How it engaged the European Union in a network of dependency, which started exactly after the war, to make sure that the Europeans do not rise again and challenge in some way or other the power that comes out of Washington. So and it is so sad to see your colleagues, and I say this honestly with sadness, at the Foreign Affairs Council, not even having a serious discussion. Perhaps is there another way of looking at this? No. Wait for what Biden is going to say, especially through Blinken, because he used to attend regularly. And I can tell you, in 2022, it became very difficult to see any difference between the Foreign Affairs Council and the Ministerial Council of NATO. It became very, very difficult to distinguish which is which, because obviously the neutral countries, including Malta, our presence was being weakened more and more, and they wanted to draw us in, and it became one block. In fact, we should rename the EU. It should be NATO EU. It cannot be just EU. If NATO is going to survive in any form in the coming years. But it's like that. And the European Union has lost all sense of leadership. And I remember Juncker making a very important point when we were going to discuss the document on strategic autonomy, that the European Union should have strategic autonomy. He said, although he used to be dismissed as, as not serious, as drinking too much, but at least they had some strategic foresight. And he used to say, if we are going to have strategic autonomy, first we should have an autonomous voice. First, we should have a voice where we speak with our voice, not simply repeat what others have said. And that is why, unfortunately, I see that all the process that started with Helsinki led nowhere. And even the notes of the State Department, when these documents were made available in 1987, sorry, in 2018, they actually say, when we look back at Helsinki, we see the tragedy of roads not taken and promises betrayed. It's so sad. We should have been celebrating, 50 years of peace and working together. When we have so many problems that can only be solved if we work together. I mean, we're going through another heat wave, climate change. If there is an area where we should be discussing and working together, but obviously with all the tension and with all the money now being devoted to militarism, global warming, where the European Union used to be a champion. I remember the European Union, we were told to be very, very proud of our European social model, that ours was not like the neoliberal American model where everything is money, militarism, we should exercise our soft power, we should lead by example. Where has all this gone? Because with 5% now devoted to the military, Europe is going to lose its model of social welfare, and we're being told, let's move from a welfare state to a warfare state, because that's what we need to do. I mean,
Well, it's on the topic of the lack of strategic autonomy of the Europeans. I had an interesting interview with Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who was the chief of staff for Powell under the Bush administration, and he told me how, again, it's on one of, I can put a link to it in the description for anyone who's interested, but he was explaining how in the White House they put up a whiteboard of the different European leaders in the different countries, and they effectively said, which one do we lift up and who do we break, like push down, and they look for, based on the extent to which they're willing to serve American interest. And he made the example that from Norway they had the Jens Stoltenberg, and they said, oh, he will do anything America wants him to do, so we have to bring up. And then so they were kind of explaining how to control the Europeans, how to make the Europeans sufficiently obedient. And I think this is so again, it's not a conspiracy theory, it's just you organize your.
and I can tell you from my personal experience how they intimidate you very politely,
Yeah.
and perhaps sometimes not so politely. Like, for example, they didn't want me to meet Lavrov. And I said, we're a sovereign country. I'm not going to meet Minister Lavrov, to discuss how we're going to undermine the United States and how we're going to use Malta, to launch nuclear missiles from Malta and attack, Europe. And we're going to discuss tourism. We're going to discuss bilateral relations, culture, education. No, why should you go? And then, as punishment, they never got me to meet Antony Blinken at the State Department. I must say, as I have no respect for Antony Blinken, I didn't feel I was being punished. In fact, I think I met some of his undersecretaries who were clever and who I could have frank discussions with. And I can tell you that they were not liking how things were going on. Like, for example, the policy of organizing a summit for democracy and dividing the world into the democratic angels and the authoritarian devils, and and this is so sad. And recently, I don't know, Glenn, whether you are aware of I think it's a brilliant book of James Fulbright about the arrogance of power. It's a really a good book where he tries to understand, where does this arrogance of power, where is it coming from, and tries to understand it even culturally, not just economic power or military power. And he says that probably it's the kind of puritanical ethic where we tell the whole world how to behave. And he says there are two phases of, he was writing this in '66. He said there are two faces in American foreign policy. One is built on the humanism of Lincoln, and the other one is built on dominance. You do what I tell you, and they behave like that, not just with Russia and with the Soviet Union, but even with Europe. It's that trend in American politics wants to dominate everyone, not just the Soviet Union or Russia. So having an egalitarian structure of security as proposed in Helsinki, as embodied in the spirit of the Charter of Paris and then the Istanbul Declaration, that doesn't go. It's NATO, because NATO is where we dominate and where we tell everyone what to do, to the point now that we've come to the pathetic point of the General Secretary calling Trump daddy. I mean, it's incredible. It's incredible.
Well, I think it's worth putting what NATO expansion meant in a context in terms of undermining all the agreements which have been reached since the Helsinki Final Act in 1975, because the Helsinki Accords, they set in place this the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, the CSCE, and in 1990 this laid the foundation for a treaty for a new Europe. Indeed, this is a Charter of Paris for a new Europe. In I think it was November of 1990.
Yeah.
I know say 1990, and then
Yes.
and it had key components. It spoke of indivisible security, which means one side should not enhance its security at the expense of others. So you have to, which goes against the concept of bloc politics. And indeed, there was supposed to be a Europe without dividing lines, and it should be based on sovereign equality. They call it the sovereignty that one side enjoys should also be enjoyed by the other. And these same principles of the Helsinki Accords were used to then convert the CSCE into an actual organization in 1994, which was the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. This was intended to be actually an inclusive security architecture for Europe, one which Russia also belonged to. And again, it was also based on the Helsinki Accords, and it introduced the same ideas. Indivisible security. It said we should also have no more, the dividing lines in Europe is over, and we should have sovereign equality. But what does NATO expansion represent? Well, then you have one side expanding its bloc towards Russian borders. Now one side is enhancing its security at the expense of the other. The dividing lines, instead of removing them, we're just moving the dividing lines closer to the Russian borders. And also NATO introduced the concept of sovereign inequality instead of sovereign equality, because what we say is, well, we are liberal democracies, you are not. So we can interfere in your domestic affairs because it's democracy promotion. You can't do that to us. We can do humanitarian interventions because, we are the champion of human rights. You can't do that. So we can do it in Kosovo. You can't do it in, let's say, Donbass or Crimea. And so you create one set of rules for us and one for them. So all of the key principles of the Helsinki Accords thrown out the window. And instead we built a hegemonic Europe. And you can explain to a child why this would create problems, how you revert to the bloc politics. And yet when we when we tell this to the Russians, suddenly now we say, no, it doesn't conflict at all. It's just, our hegemony is benign. It's a liberal hegemon. When we dominate, everyone will benefit, like the philosopher king, because we're going to help everyone develop their democracy, good governance, and all the bloc politics is just, shoved under the rug. And we present the Russians as somehow being, pursuing conspiracy theories that, we betrayed them. Well, of course, we stabbed them in the back multiple times over and over again. And then this is why I think it's interesting if you bring it to the present time, because when now we're saying, well, we weren't really going to expand the NATO to Ukraine. We were just saying that. And also, now that the Americans are trying to suggest a ceasefire, we do a ceasefire. Trust us. We're just going to, then we'll have a political discussion about a settlement. I mean, can you blame the Russians for not trusting us? If I was advising them, I would tell them,
No.
you cannot trust. This is how many times can you possibly be
Yes.
deceived? And let's be honest, the deception is already in the game. They're not going to deliver on anything they're saying. So the trust is gone for very good reason.
But I see this consistently. One phrase that I learned, I hadn't thought of it before, was that we should only have meetings with like-minded countries. So even when it came way back to the United Nations, if you see how the United States treats the United Nations, again, there it's a multilateral organization. There you have to treat everyone as equal, even though you have obviously the veto power and you do whatever you like. But don't use the United Nations. Again, when you come to CSC and OSCE, no, show your preference to NATO, because NATO, that is where you have your people together and you do, what you decide to do. And we are taking this now to ridiculous extents. And I was quite shocked recently. I read a speech given by Christine Lagarde and Janet Yellen, who had spent years, decades, talking about open borders, globalization, how we need open trade, how we need to work with each other. And they were actually telling the CEO of companies, from now on, trade is going to happen more and more within a narrow basket of friends who share our values. Now, this is before Trump. This is 4 years ago. I mean, to take this idea of that there is a narrow basket of friends and we'll only live here, I think it shows the deep crisis and the decline of a unipolar world where the European Union is part of it only because it wants to grab details of the jacket of the United States instead of building a new relationship with the rest of the world. Because there are people within the European Union and within European politics who were ready over the years to have an equal relationship with the rest of the world, which is not built on 500 years of colonialism, where you do what I tell you. There were those who are still believing that that colonialism is still there. But there have been others who, during the years, wanted to work with building, an equal relationship with Africa, with Asia, with Latin America. Those, unfortunately, have been weakened. And the European Union now is in a situation where it cannot accept the reality of what is happening. That power is shifting, technology is shifting, the economy is shifting. And what are we to do? Militarize as a shortcut, which is also very, very short-sighted. Well, what I also think is happening now because of this is that they are turning against their own people. So the high moral ground of before of human rights, democracy, liberty, it's become very difficult to talk openly if you're not going to be accused of being a traitor. If the majority of people say we don't want war and we are not going to be recruited in armies, then, still do what you can to go against them. And I think as a result, the European Union has already lost, I think, its credentials to be a democratic leader, also especially because of its complicity with the genocide in Gaza and having double standards and two weights and two measures. In some areas you see repression and lack of liberty, but in other areas where it's geopolitically convenient, you don't. So even that has been lost now. The credibility of having the soft power of leading by example and having the politics of values and of soft power rather than hard power.
You said something interesting about undermining the United Nations, because this has been a historical thing. Whenever you want to try to establish an international institution that represents international law, be it the concert of Europe or now the present United Nations, whatever you want it to be, one of the things that historically undermines it is that states will then have more loyalties to exclusive alliances rather than this framework for international law. And this was part of the problem also of NATO, one can say, because when NATO expanded for the first time then after the Cold War in March of 1999, less than 2 weeks later, it attacked Yugoslavia. Now, this is important because this attack on Yugoslavia, it did not have a mandate from the United Nations. It was an illegal attack and a war of aggression against Yugoslavia by NATO. But the rhetoric then was interesting because I was actually in the army then, and I remember very well how they spoke. They said, well, yes, it's not illegal, but we're faced with the threat of a veto from Russia and China, and they don't believe, they don't have the same liberal democratic and humanitarian values as us. So NATO then has to be able to push it aside and act in the spirit of the UN. And this was starting. So in other words, you create a dominant NATO in Europe, and then it has the essentially authority to push the UN aside and then act on its own mandate. And this is and this is often what we refer to as the rules-based international orders.
Yes.
We have different an alternative set of rules. So it's very
We write the rules and you obey them, you know.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, that's perfect.
the problem is that they feel they own the United Nations. They were the only country that after the Second World War could house as an institution like that, using their budget also to control the United Nations, and no respect for it. I'll just tell you an episode recently, without giving a lot of details, but I know that recently the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, would have liked to meet Marco Rubio. He refused to see it and told him, talk to our ambassador. I mean, it's this kind of arrogance shows that it's not true that you believed in common rules for everyone, that you are bound by the same, by the same reality and within the same common framework. I only accept the framework where I dominate and where others do what I tell them. And this is terrible. This is terrible. And again, recently, I was referring to the book of James Fulbright, who says that, we used to attack the Vietnamese of fighting for their country because they were simply obeying orders from Moscow or from Beijing. And he said, it shows that you have never read a book of history about Vietnam and the geography of Vietnam, and you would understand that we've been fighting the Chinese for 1,000 years, and we're not now going to simply obey what they tell us. And Ho Chi Minh, when he announced the Declaration of Independence, he was actually quoting the American Constitution. So simply saying, Ho Chi Minh is a communist puppet and things like that. It's terrible, and we see this happening over and over again. It doesn't leave you much hope and optimism, but at the same time, I think the only hope is that the rest of the world, at least the 86%, which is not controlled completely by Washington, can stand up and push back this kind of dominance. It seems that it's the only way that you can keep domination away. I only hope that we can find an arrangement without going to war, because unfortunately, in these kind of periods where you have a declining power and other powers emerging, usually it results in war. And it is something which in an atomic age, we cannot afford to have.
No, I agree. And I guess that's my last question in terms of if there's any reason to be more optimistic now, because, well, again, in the bipolar world, during the Cold War or the unipolar world, there was always a very zero-sum game with the Russians. I mean, if they're weak, they're good for us. But these days, if we don't accommodate them and just always go for the deception and trying to weaken them more, what we see now is we're pushing them further towards other centers of power. So again, in the 19th century, when we try to push Russia back into Asia, the idea was, you push it into an insignificant region. But now we're pushing it in the arms of China, India, Iran, like all these Eurasian giants. So it kind of, from my perspective, taking a very political realist, would be that the incentives have changed a little bit. That if you try to weaken Russia now, you end up with empowering your opponents instead of marginalizing it in Europe. In other words, would you like a powerful have common security with Russia in Europe, or do you want to face a very powerful Eurasian bloc instead? So it seems as if in a multipolar system that there could be some hope for reviving some of the Helsinki Act or processes. Do you see it in the same way, or as you began this talk, don't share my optimism
But
always?
only Glenn, if it's taken as a reality check.
Yeah.
I remember the superficial discussion we had when the war broke out in Ukraine. Just a bit before. I remember having a discussion with Josep Borrell about this. And I told him, are you sure you're not pushing Russia into China's embrace? No. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. Russia doesn't trust China. Also because the Chinese are invading Siberia, they're going to take over. So the Chinese are considered too dominant by the Russians. I mean, and it was built on this premise, like on the premise that if we sanction Russia heavily, we're going to defeat it economically, if not militarily, And it's as if you don't remember that the world is not made up only of the G7 and the EU, that there are 86% living in the rest of the world. So this kind of historical short-sightedness that comes out of historical arrogance. I still believe, I consider it an advantage that we're one of the few countries in the European Union where we've been colonized, not colonizers. So our perspective is different from those who had empires. So we can see the European Union from below, not from on top, from inside, but also from below. And I see that mindset still there. I only hope that there will be a reality check when, in the years to come, even what is being proposed in terms of militarization and of going for hard power fails. At least there will be a return to sobriety, a return to rationality, a return to sitting together and see what we can do together to negotiate. I only hope we can do this. I hope that it can be done with the United States. I hope it can be done with the European Union, with the rest of the world, with BRICS, with Latin America, with Asia, with Africa. Because otherwise the situation will simply get worse.
Well, on that semi-optimistic note, I think we can leave it. So, thank you so much. I appreciate your insights on this, because I do think that the discussion on pan-European security architecture is really one we should be having. Our politicians should be having, but instead
we should learn from history.
Exactly. Yeah.
But we must always remember that history is a good teacher, but we need to be good students. We cannot depend only on the teacher.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.